My mother had 9 brothers and sisters, so she came from a big family. My father, although he had 2 sisters and a half-brother here in the States, he grew up in Sicily with his grandparents. His grandfather was named, as he was, Dominic, or Domenico, and his second wife was from the Golotta family, and but she treated him like a son, and he considered her his mother. And he spoke of them in endearing terms all the time. And he said he was never treated even like a step-grandson. There was no distinction between any of the children, the sons from the first or the second marriage. And he grew up in a great, great household, and he had to. But he had some pretty terrible shocks, too, because his grandfather lost both his second oldest son, who was my grandfather, and his youngest son, Giuseppe Peppino, in the First World War. Peppino was just lost. They never heard from him again. And my father remembers that when the message came to the house, his grandfather was out in the field working, and it was harvest time. And his wife got the news, and she could not tell him, because if she did, the harvest would not be completed, and it would be a total disaster. So she held it for a few days and then just burst out. It was her son too. And he said, non Domenico, his grandfather Domenico, took a knife, not a knife, like a butcher's knife, those big thick things, and whacked himself in the head with it and put a big cut on his head. He lived to about 96, I think. So there was a long, genetically he was well endowed. A man who, for 6 months, didn't go to church, which was extraordinary. And then he went back. And he used to, my father used to say, as he was growing up, when he got home from the fields, and they worked, and they washed up after supper, they would sit down, and he would, a man who had never learned to read or write, but knew hundreds of sayings, and had memorized the litany of prayers. And as my father said, he knew more than a priest did. He could say the whole Mass in Latin. He would make them, they sat down, he, his wife, and my father, and they said the rosary, and then he repeated a litany which lasted, he said, an hour or so. And then then he would say, my father would say, want to go to town? And he'd say, what, are you crazy? He said, go to bed. Tomorrow you have to get up at 4 in the morning. And my father would dutifully go up to bed, crawl out the window, and go to town, and hang out with the guys, and they hung out. Sometimes they had music, and they would dance, but the men danced with the men, because there were no women in town. You didn't dance with women. The only time you danced with a woman was when somebody had a private party, and the private party was with people who knew each other. One asked permission of the brother or the father to dance with the ladies, and it was understood that they could, but you had to ask all kinds of permission. And he had a tough life, my father. I mean, his father died when he was 10 or so, and brought up by grandparents, but he was well treated. He was given, as I understand it, his father's piece of the inheritance, because he had to divvy it up among those who remained. And he got an extra piece as if he was another son, because he worked the fields with his grandfather. Now, my father, one day, I don't know where we were, upstate New York somewhere, I pick up a rock and throw it. And he picks up a rock and he throws it. I said, Bob, you just threw that rock left-handed. He said, I'm lefty. I said, really? I said, I didn't know that. Because he wrote righty, he played a guitar right-handed. He says, you couldn't be left-handed. He said, you weren't left-handed. You had to do things right-handed. He said, but throwing rocks, you could throw any way you wanted. He said, and Non Domenico was left-handed too. I said, really? He says, yeah. He said, in fact, he said, when we were out in the fields and we were cutting hay or whatever it was that they cut, he said, you had to be careful because the left-handed guys would cut. And he says, they could cut into you because if everybody cut right-handed, and I certainly don't know how to use a scythe or whatever it is that they cut, everybody's right-handed, we all swing in the same direction at the same time. But you got a left-handed guy in there, you had to be careful. So he mentioned that. He said, but he was, I remember how proud he was, the fact that he could cut more hay in a given number of hours than anybody else. And he, like Non Domenico, he says nobody could keep up with him in cutting hay. I mean, these were the values that I grew up listening to. Not the guy who would get away with doing the least, but the guy who would cut the most hay. And you cut the most hay, you brought it home, and you had hay to sell and to harvest the olives. And they used to bring the olives to a place where they had a mill, and they would crush it, and you would get olive oil. So I used to tell my father, when we went to the store, I said, Bob, we're going to buy extra virgin olive oil. And he'd start laughing. He said, what's that? He said, well, olive oil is olive oil. There was no extra virgin or olive oil or oil mixed with anything. It was crushed, and you got olive oil out. And it was, of course, the first pressing. And it had a green color to it, and sometimes it was opaque. But it was great stuff. He had fields there in Sicily that had grapes that he sold to somebody from Salaparuta. Did you ever hear of Corvo wine? Corvo di Salaparuta was a popular wine about 15 or 20 years ago. Big. It's a Sicilian wine. He sold the wine to the owner of the prince, I guess, Principe di Salaparuta. That's the guy who, in fact, they still have that wine in the stores. Corvo wine is a fairly well-known, classy wine from Sicily. He sold them grapes. And from that little town, a number of extraordinary people came. The mayor of the town was a doctor who delivered me. He had no children. He didn't deliver me. My Aunt Rose and her sisters were there because doctors didn't deliver babies. The babies were delivered naturally, like goats and sheep and cows and whoever else. They called them only if there's a problem. There was no problem. But he became a senator in Rome. And a book was written about him, which I think I showed you, but he was the man who delivered, and he also took care of my father when he had, if I'm not mistaken, he had typhoid fever, and he was very, very sick shortly after they got married, my parents. And then while in Sicily, things were, as my son says about Alaska, he says, there's no crime up in Alaska. There are 2 guns for every person up there. Is no crime and no cops. You can't call a cop because you're way out in the wilderness, so you have to take care of yourself. And everybody does. Well, down in Sicily, it was pretty much the same thing. You took the law into your own hands because at one time there were Spaniards and there were French and there were Germans and there were, way before that, the Phoenicians and the Arabs and the Greeks and all. So everybody had to learn to take care of himself. And because my father had some property and there were people who wanted to, they wait until the harvest time and then they go and they threaten you with your life or kidnapping if you don't hand over some of the grain. My father being an impatient guy and not likely, if you knew him, you'd know what I'm talking about. He's no way in hell. When they waylaid him on the way home from the fields, he got the gun out and he said to them, they were saying, you know, we're going to shoot your mules, or animals of burden. He said, go ahead. He said, I'll get you first, though. And there were all kinds of shots fired and all. And then when my father came back to town, and told my mother, she got frightened about it and all and said, you know, this is going to be a disaster. So at that point he decided, you know, let's let things cool off, because he wounded a couple of guys as far as I know. And he came back to the States, came to the States with my mother and me, and from then on, we stayed.
Father and mother talk about their first couple of years together when they first got married and they were still in Sicily?
Mostly the discussion was that soon after they got married, my father got sick. And then afterwards he had this encounter with these people who wanted him to pay, what do they call, protection money. And then they came to the States, and when they came to the States, both my parents went to work.
Why did they come to the States?
Well, for one thing, to get away from this situation, which might have become more violent, and secondly, because my father always wanted to meet that uncle of his father's brother, who was the only one alive of the 6 sons from the first marriage. The family of one of those sons, Gaspar Marino, Gaspar was Vito's full brother, as was Leonardo. Leonardo, my grandfather, died in World War I. Gaspar was in the States, and he's the one who died of a ruptured appendix on Thanksgiving Day. And before we arrived, I don't remember the year, had to be 1918 or something like that. And he wanted to see his uncle. And so we came to the States, and tough times. Jobs were hard to get. My father worked with my uncle, and my mother went to work in a sweatshop, making, I don't know what, some people used to make sweaters. She, for the most part, as I remember, made sewed pants.
How do you just pick up and leave?
Tough. They were in there. Well, it came in 1935. My mother was born in 1910, so she was 25 years old. Well, they didn't come to an unknown land. They didn't know English and never really learned English very well. They could converse. I mean, they could go shopping and they could get things done. My mother could go wherever she wanted to go. Highly accented English, but understandable. They were coming to family. I mean, they weren't coming to a new world where there was no one here. I mean, my father's uncle was here, on the Marino side, and on the De Prima side, my mother's, let's see, her aunt was here. Her mother's sister was here and lived in Canarsie section of Brooklyn at the time. And they had been here longer, and their children all went to college, so they were fairly educated people.
How did your father meet your mother?
In those little towns, everybody knew everybody, just about. The town was roughly 8,000. At one point, it reached 12,000 people, but everybody knew each other. And there's an expression in Sicilian, which is that beasts of burden and wives from the same town. Because if you bought a beast of burden, a mule, a donkey, a horse, you knew because everybody knew about it, and they knew if it was a wild animal or one who would work hard and one who wasn't sick all the time. And the same thing about women. So on Sundays, generally after Mass, they would walk up and down the piazza and they would see each other. Everybody saw each other, and this is the way they met. You never said a word to the person. You then decided that you found out if they were in the right age category, if they were married, if they weren't, what the family background was, whether there were any criminal elements in the family, or whether they had some finances, or whatever their situation was. And then you sent a friend of yours as an emissary to the family friend who presented a situation where so-and-so would like to become serious with your daughter. And then they would find out who this individual was. They often knew. And my mother was not the oldest of the sisters, and you married the oldest one first. And another saying in town was the mother marries the oldest daughter off, meaning the reputation. And then the oldest daughter marries off the younger ones, because how that marriage turns out determines, not necessarily, but that's the attitude, determines how the rest of them will turn out. And my mother was not the oldest, and the information was given back to my father, who apparently, his reaction was, well, since I'm marrying into the family, if she's not the oldest, I'll take the oldest. But my mother knew about it, and there was a big session with the oldest sisters and a lot of tears and what have you. And the oldest sister gave up her right of marriage to her youngest sister, my mother, so that my mother could, who wanted to marry my father, even though she didn't know him. They never exchanged a word. But they knew of reputations. That older sister eventually married, and she became my godmother, so she remained in the family. I mean, they were all friends in the family. Of course, as each sister and brother marries and they bring in other people, of course, there were always some difficulties in the family, but essentially it worked pretty well. And then I was born, and I was the only grandson around, and so I used to say my feet never hit the ground, because I went from aunt to uncle to, I mean, and I don't remember that part of it. But when I went back after I was drafted into the Army, I went back, let's see, drafted in December of '53, must have been '54. I went back and I took some movies, which you'll see. And my grandparents were there, and I could see the resemblance between my mom and her mom. And they came from, my mother's maiden name was Di Prima, but her mother's maiden name was Jaraputo. You say Jaraputo. My mother was, I don't know if anybody didn't love her. She was just very peace-loving, and she had to be. My father was a ramrod type of impatient guy, a loving guy, but tough. And my relatives, those who grew up with him, knew him. And in fact, in his old days, when he was here and he was just doing things that drove me nuts, I used to say to him, "Pop, you made two saints in your life. My mother, because she had to live with you all those years, you know, she died young, and you are making me one, putting up with you." But he was a loving man. A young, not overly muscled man, but very strong. And I know, because he'd get up in the morning and he'd come home late in the afternoon, but he was up in the morning at, I don't know, 5:30 or so. And at one point we lived near the garage where the trucks were. And the trucks were these old Mack trucks. And some of them had flat tires. Some later on had balloon tires, but the ones with the flat tires, you had to start with a crank. And later on, when I got older and I saw what they did, they'd crank this thing up in the morning and then take the wooden posts that were underneath it to prevent it from sinking into the ground, because the garage, the weight of the trucks would make them sink down. They would then back them out of the garage, go to the macaroni companies, deliver a load of macaroni, and then drive back to the railroad yards and load the trucks up for the next day with flour sacks that weighed, I don't know, 120 to 150 pounds each, which they carried on their shoulders. And they would take a sack, a clean sack, and push one end into the other, the closed end, and they made a hood of it. And they put the hood over their heads so it would protect their shoulders and cover their heads so they didn't get as much flour in their faces and in their hair and on their bodies. And I remember working like that. I mean, such hard physical work. And then his words to me as I got older, he said to me, "You go to school and you do what you have to do in school. Don't worry about work. And he said, the day you start work will be the first day, and you will never stop working after that. So you delay work until you can, but go to school. I'll worry about the tuition and the payments. You go to school." And he informed me later on that Uncle Vito, his grandfather's brother, had said to him that if you don't have the funds to finish him going to school, you let me know, I'll be there for you. And I knew he would have been. He was a kind, generous person.
Tell me more about when you were a kid, and tell me more about your father.
Yeah. Well, I remember him being a hard worker. I remember him being very stern. He never punished me physically, except one time on a Sunday when they got me dressed up. We were going to go somewhere, and I wandered down to the corner, and I made the turn, and I was watching guys playing horseshoes. And I was supposed to be home in 15 or 20 minutes, and I probably watched these guys for an hour. I had no idea what the time was, didn't have a watch. And my parents couldn't find me. They were distraught. They thought I had been kidnapped. Because in those days, the Lindbergh kidnapping was, something that was in the newspapers. Well, when they found me, my mother had to stop my father from walloping me, which he did on the rear end. And he shoved her out of the way. But it wasn't anger. It was relief and anger together that I had caused him that much distress. But he was relieved to find me. And that's all, the only time I can remember. Always working. It was, as they say now, my way or the highway with him. There was only one way. It was his way. Most of the time he was right. Sometimes he wasn't. And as I got a little older and I became more adept at doing things, fixing things, for instance, the first washing machine, clothes washing machine we bought was a Bendix. At that time, that was a popular brand. And it was a front loader with a circular door in the front. And it had to be put on the ground. And when we turned it on, the thing started vibrating. So I figured out a way to cement it into the ground. And it was the first time I was smarter than my father at something. I was about 16. Up until then, he always knew more than I did about everything. And whatever he said, we did, and he was right. We lived by that time in a two-family house on Cornelia Street. And it was shortly after that, that new thing. After all, I started going to college, and he bought a car. We got a phone when I went to college. We didn't have a phone until then. People visited each other just by going to each other's houses. But my father always spent Sunday mornings, almost every Sunday, going over to visit his Uncle Vito and his cousins at their house. My mom did the cooking. Went to church, came home from church. My brother was young at the time. We'd eat disappointed if she didn't make meatballs. And she knew it, and she almost always made meatballs Sunday, sauce, meatballs, pasta. We ate a big meal around 1 o'clock or so, and then in the afternoon, later on sometimes, once a week, cold cuts and cakes. The rest of the week, there was no dessert in the house. That just wasn't eaten. We ate fruit and vegetables, which they overcooked, because that's the way they did it in Sicily. I never knew what steamed vegetables could taste like because they were all overcooked. And I never liked those vegetables. I found out later when my wife, who became a superb cook, my wife who really didn't know how to cook when we got married, but boy, she learned. She was a better cook than her mother and my mother put together. Excellent cook. She loved it, and she cooked for my parents and her parents, and everybody was happy and proud.
Let me go back again.
Sure.
What was a typical day like for your father?
Well, my mother worked in a sweatshop, as my father did, and she would.
What's a sweatshop?
A sweatshop is a place where they sew together clothes. During the war years, most of the clothes were heavy-duty military because that's what the clothing industry was like, and a lot of it was in the New York area, out in Queens and Brooklyn, and there were many shops. And I can remember one time my mother used to talk about the Germany, and I used to say, what is she talking about? Do they have a German guy in every shop who's making all these people produce at a rapid rate? Turns out she was talking about the shop chairman. And I somehow took years before I figured out what she was talking about. And they used to talk about piecework or work where you got a set salary. And she preferred piecework because she wanted to work harder and faster to make a few more bucks. I mean, those days they made $60 in a week was a big deal. And I used to ask her what she did. And she used to say, Tackenzime. And I used to say, what in the hell is a Tackenzime? What she meant was tack and seam, which was a way to describe the kinds of things they did to put clothes together. They made pants, or for the most part, I guess it was mostly pants. Then along the way, my father went to work for Ripley Clothes in Manhattan, and he used to press pants, and my mother sewed them. When they bought the first car, at my request, I was about 20 at the time, was a red Plymouth convertible. Beautiful car. Wish I had it now.
Let me go back again.
Yes.
Tell me about your mom. What was she like?
Yeah.
Tell me about your mom.
Okay, I'm going to get to that. And the car part
Okay.
is important because what would happen is she'd get home from work and she would walk home to save the nickel or so, whatever it was on the trolley car. And it was a little inconvenient, but she'd walk home, go to the A&P or somewhere, do some shopping, carry the bags home, and whoever got home first would do the cooking. Some of the cooking was pretty fresh. Some was left over, you know, veal cutlets and what have you, that were warmed up. But when I got home, I would, if it was in time, I would quickly get into the car and go pick her up at work. And she loved it because not only could she show off her son who was in college and the nice car that they had bought, but I could pick her up and she didn't have to walk home. So I would drive to the A&P, she'd shop, we'd put the bags in the car, we'd go home, I'd put the car in the garage, and then I didn't know how to cook anything. I mean, I loved to wash the dishes afterwards. I didn't like to dry them, but I would wash the dishes. So it was my job. I never thought of it as being a burden. On Saturdays, the house had to be cleaned. So I would wash windows, and the Venetian blinds had to be wiped. So I wiped the Venetian blinds, I washed the windows. I remember she wanted the floor. We had parquet floors. It was a beautiful two-story, two-family house on Cornelia Street in Ridgewood, right on the border. We always lived on the border of Queens and Brooklyn. And while she was doing whatever work she was doing, she asked me if I could make the floors look good. So I rented a sander and buffer and what have you, and I did the whole house, and then I put the version of polyurethane back in 1951 or 2, whatever it was. And I loved doing it for my mother. She was so proud of the fact that I didn't think of it as being unmanly. Hey, you helped your mother. I mean, it's what you did. There was nothing strange about it. Some mothers didn't ask or expect, but they did, and I never quibbled. It was my job to do it, and I did it. And then I might go outside later on in the day and wash the car, which didn't need it, and put a coat of Simonize on, which also didn't need it. But then I hung around with the other guys on the block who had cars, and we would talk cars, you know, and question the characteristics of the motors of the different companies. We could sit there, the guys, and listen to cars go by, and we could tell by the sound of the motor what company made the car. It was amazing. We could tell if it was a Chrysler product or a GM or a Ford. And then in those days there were Packards and Studebakers and Nash, and Kaiser and Fraser. There were lots of cars then, Willys. But Mom would always be the house lady, cook, do whatever my father wanted, never argue with him, very occasionally, and reminisce about the fact that they left Sicily when they were in their 20s and never went back. I knew my father as a person who was short-tempered. He would give you what he could. After the Second World War, people would write saying, we are starving. People used to work for him on the farm. We have no anything. And my father would make packages, and my father would send one package with his name, one package with my mother's name, and one package with my name to the people over there. I mean, it's not like he collected it from the Salvation Army. Whatever he could from whatever relatives, he would say, look, I want to send a package to so-and-so. They have nothing. That letter makes you cry. And so he did that. He sent lots of stuff. But if you went up and demanded something of him, you were not likely to get it. So, in fact, I'm going to tell a story now that I rarely tell. But he told me that one time when Zio Baldassare, the first child born of Domenico's second marriage, the one whose son eventually graduated from the Italian West Point and is the youngest general in the Italian army. When he was a young man, came back from the fields, somebody threatened him and he was told that if he didn't pay up, that um, they would somehow kidnap him or beat him up or whatever. And my father heard about it, and the grandfather, my father's grandfather, to protect his son, said, you know, don't go out in the field, don't do this or that, whatever it was. And my father said, but when they threatened my grandfather, my father just couldn't tolerate it. So he found out who the guy was. He went out to the field and shot him. That was Sicilian justice. And nobody did anything because they knew this guy was an extortionist and a man of terrible character. And he made his living by threatening people and getting money. And my father just, he said, you can't threaten my grandfather and my uncle. And he just took it upon himself. When he didn't tell anybody, as far as I know. Went out there, boom, he wasted him, and that was it. And people in town probably knew about it, but nobody went to arrest him or anything because he had done a good deed, so to speak. But so I knew my father as a good and generous man, but he didn't take any crap from anybody. Unfortunately, taking crap from somebody is a subjective thing, so you have to be careful of that. But in any case, that was Pop. But Pop would lay his life down for his family, and he expressed it, and he did it.